The old trolley problem. So you got a trolley, you got some people standing on the tracks, and the question is whether to let, say, 5 people die or pull a lever to switch the tracks so that only one person dies. Now, a guy named David Pizarro was the lead author of a paper that looked at the trolley problem, but it had a twist. Sometimes it was a choice between killing a black person, Tyrone, to save 100 white people, and sometimes it was a choice of killing a white person, Chip, in order to save 100 black people. And Pizarro looked at the results based on political views of college students at UC Irvine, Fresno State, Cornell University, and of random adults from the Orange County area. There was another scenario involving throwing a wounded Chip or Tyrone off of a lifeboat in order to save everyone else. And here we have the results based on self-report as whether one is more liberal or more conservative. For the more quote-unquote conservative, they're more willing to sacrifice Tyrone than Chip, right? A normal, healthy reaction. But past a certain threshold, you start to see a preference for Tyrone over Chip. Now, a problem with the study is that there's no real breakdown of the race of these respondents. However, there was another study looking at the tolerance for collateral damage in war, and the responses varied whether or not the collateral damage was on Iraqis or quote-unquote Americans. And past a certain point on the scale, respondents were more likely to sacrifice American lives than quote-unquote Iraqi lives. Now, this isn't a racial question, but it fits a pattern of xenophilia, or outgroup preference, among what is called the left. In an event on the matter, Pizarro talks about how people react to questions about race and nationality affecting their choices on who to kill. Quote, another finding we got is, if you're curious, that some people, when we presented these results, would say, well, you know, liberals are right because, in fact, a black life is worth more than a white life. These were white liberals from New York City, Chicago, just so you know. Fair enough, maybe that's the case for these people, but overwhelmingly our participants, when asked, deny that this is the case. Now, in-group preference is totally natural. If you're white and you are more likely to sacrifice Tyrone than you are to sacrifice Chip, that is something innate. That is something neurotypical. And if anyone tries to tell you otherwise, that there is something wrong with you for favoring your own, they're actually trying to classify a kind of mental illness as normal, and that which is normal as a mental illness. Let's talk about the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club used to be against immigration to the United States. Why wouldn't they be? More people means more pollution, and if one area of the world is overpopulated and those people leave for another country, well, now there's more room in the other country for it to get overpopulated again. So prohibiting the free movement of people is probably the most important thing you could do to protect the environment. And it's sort of intuitively plausible given that people are the ones that destroy the environment. But over time, the Sierra Club changed its tune and came to support open borders. They came to put brown people over the environment. We can also look at the AFL-CIO, how they used to be a labor union who wanted an economy built around labor that didn't just treat labor as an input to maximize profit, but labor as the end in itself. However, eventually the unions came to side with big business in favor of open borders. Big businesses love open borders because it makes it so labor can't organize anywhere. All these communists and anarchists are thus useful for the establishment when their energies are directed at open borders agitation. The unions have decided that having brown people in the United States is more important than having organized bargaining power. And of course, now that they destroyed their own ability to organize labor by opening the borders, the labor unions themselves are basically non-existent. One thing that people who call themselves leftists tend to like to imagine is that they support universal health care. Well, the state of California, which is overwhelmingly brown and Democrat, and so you know they really wanted this to work, did an investigation to figure out how to pass universal health care in California. And they came to the realization that they simply could not afford it. They can afford it in Denmark. They can afford it in Norway, in Iceland, even in Sweden for the time being, but they can't afford it in California. Also, yes, as it happens, Democrats tend to support universal health care more than Republicans, but that's just inertia from the past. When you tell Republicans and Democrats that universal health care is Donald Trump's idea, they end up supporting it at about the same rate. For now, sure, more Democrats support universal health care, all else being equal, because that used to just kind of be what the Democrats did. But given how big these swings are, this doesn't appear to be something inherent in the kind of people who support Trump. and it's not something essential to what is called the quote-unquote right, if such a thing even exists. Here's a little anecdote. In Brooklyn, they're dropping gifted programs because too many whites are in the gifted programs. Now, imagine if the state of Kansas dropped gifted programs because too many Asians or too many Hispanics or Indians were in those gifted programs. You'd never hear the end of it, right? Of course you wouldn't. You'd have civil rights lawsuits coming out the ass over that. But when the Brooklyn blacks do it, it's okay and you don't even hear about it. Or how about women's rights and gay rights? Now, this is a horse that has been beaten to death because it's so obvious, but it should be brought up again for those who forgot. And that's the hypocrisy of supporting women's and gays' rights while bringing in people who mostly want gays dead and women behind closed doors, which is to say Muslims, or at least true Muslims. Maybe they do care about women's rights and gays, maybe, who knows. But one thing for sure is that they care more about having brown people in Europe than they care about women and gays. Also, atheism. That's another thing that liberals, quote unquote, like to push, or at least they used to push. It was atheism. They'd constantly rail against the mostly fictional menace of extreme Christianity in the United States, and now they want to bring in Muslims, one of, if not the most religious population on the planet. But increasingly, as the United States gets browner, you're starting to see secularism get dropped, because atheism, that was one of these like white liberal things. Remember when abortion was a huge election issue and the moral majority was this cup of trembling? None of that matters anymore. None of these things are coming up anymore. It's all about race now. It would be a hell of a task, but I think it's possible to get rid of this notion of left-wing or liberal. This may be a silly thing to reach towards, but I think in fantasy lore like Warhammer and Lord of the Rings, what's going on there is actually a lot clearer. Because when they're talking about their fantasy universes, they're not bounded by the norms and restrictions on opinion that someone is going to have at any time and place in history, because they're basically outside of this universe, creating this universe. Saruman sides with Sauron, who rules the orcs, along with aligning with the Middle Eastern people, the Haredim or whatever. Those who betray their people and side with Sauron and the wizard Saruman are the most despicable of all. Or in the Warhammer series, those who become corrupted by the chaos and join a multicultural alliance of chaos along with the orcs. Now, the orcs, of course, they don't have to be corrupted by the chaos, because they fight alongside the liberals, because that's just what blacks do. The natural human instinct is to view those corrupted by chaos or those who sided with Sauron as traitors. So you have someone who values the Iraqis over the Americans. That's left-wing? No, that's just you favoring a group more distant from you over your own, or at least what you perceive as your own, American. Though the reality of American is another topic for another time. Now here's where you gotta have a few brain cells. You can rationalize whatever you want. The chaos narrative, the anti-white narrative, talks about the evil oppression of the European race. And they'll say something about a historical context about these groups, and about how all these groups are disadvantaged or whatever. And if you ever question this group narrative, if you ever question this historical narrative, well, you're treated like a heretic. Or the term today, it's racist. But it's all nothing more than seeing everything from the point of view of another group. You're not high-minded or beyond tribalism by doing this. You've just traded one nationalism for another, and swallowed the narrative that goes along with it. Now, maybe you want to boomerang this argument back to me and say, well, you're a self-proclaimed white nationalist, and so your view must be muddled by seeing things from your group's point of view. And that's probably true to some extent. But there's a huge difference between having a known bias that stems from a natural, healthy, neurotypical in-group preference, and having a kind of xenophilia, but not recognizing it as such and imagining that it's not xenophilia, and that you have a point of view that is above group identity, and that this is the view of science and rationality and truth, and it's the view of progress, and we are progressives, and we are for all that is good and wonderful, fighting against the retrograde conservative forces of white identity, or excuse me, white supremacy, as you call it. It's a totalistic worldview that literally blames all of the world's problem on a single group. group, Europeans. The Imperium is the cause of all of our misfortunes. In addition, I couldn't make an echo chamber even if I wanted to. I live in your world, you don't live in mine. When I say something, I am always countered. You're probably rarely countered, or if you are, it's by some shit-eater boomer Republican who accepts 80% of your premises before the argument even starts, and then he'll just cling to some threadbare classical liberal quote-unquote values nonsense. And he always loses, and he always looks like a tool because he's allowed himself to be totally nerfed into just babbling about the Americult or something about some constitution that used to exist. And for these reasons, I don't really think of there being a left wing. Now, you can make left wing and define it to be whatever you want, but look, the terms left wing and right wing, they have to be defined in each use. If you want to get really anal and talk about the three estates in France, well, then the Democrats, I think today, we should call them right-wing, as they are in line with the professor priests and the bureaucrat noblemen, while the working class votes Republican now. Heck, they're increasingly, Democrats' views are in line with the literal priests of the churches today, as the churches start to go full-on third-worldist. So there, if you want to keep left-wing and right-wing, well then really we should call the Democrat coalition right-wing at this point. And we are the left. But it's all just stupid. Really, humans are tribal and nationalistic, and they glob onto group narratives of the tribe that they identify with. That's all. That's all that's going on. That's all that has ever gone on. And it is a great danger to imagine that this is not what you are doing. Everything else is just a big, after-the-fact song and dance.